You were there with her the first time. Okay, thank you very much. Are we live streaming through? Okay, all right.
Oh, now you are.
Okay, very good. Well, hi, welcome. Sorry we're a few minutes late. No, so happy and proud to be part of this organization. We were one of the first member, I think the first member to join up with Flair, and just the leadership there. You know, if you look at the work over the years that Diana and Myra and Nancy and Anita and Katie, I mean, all the people who've worked so hard to make this organization really sing. And now it's doing something just great by bringing so much attention to these remarkable human beings that we call First Ladies. I welcome you to Grand Rapids. This is talk about remarkable. This is a very remarkable mid-sized American city that feels much larger in some ways and smaller in some ways too. Smaller in the sense that when you get to know the lives of Jerry and Betty Ford, then you see that the small town sort of Midwestern values became such a part of their lives. And we're celebrating, by the way, the 50th anniversary of President and Mrs. Ford getting to the White House. It happened on August 9th, 1974. And we are, as a foundation there at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, one of the things we do is we work with Brooke Clement, who's the director at the Library and Museum. We work very closely because we're trying to build institutional heft to push back against the civic nihilism, the civic ignorance in our society today. So very important. And Flair is a good partner for that in bringing so much attention to the First Ladies. 40 years ago, of course, so 50 years ago, you know, President and Mrs. Ford get to the White House. 40 years ago is this remarkable conference. Now, Mrs. Ford, it would have been in April, so this month, April 18th, I believe, 17th, 18th, 19th. One of the reasons we're focusing, even though it's the 50th anniversary of primarily President Ford, that's what people are thinking of, we're saying, wait a second. Hold yourself right there in your tracks, because it's the 40th anniversary of an important conference. Why is that important? Because as First Lady, 50 years ago, Mrs. Ford was diagnosed with breast cancer on September 26th, 1974. And it was the way she responded to that diagnosis that changed women's history. Think about it. Mrs. Ford insisted, first of all, that she be in on all the conversations with the doctor. It wasn't just going to be a male-to-male thing where the little woman, you know, just wasn't quite strong enough constitutionally to take the word breast cancer. And you'll recall, I mean, I wasn't that old in 1974, but I do recall people got squeamish when they said the word breast at the dinner table. They certainly didn't want to say it, you know, on air or, you know, in the newspapers. So it was just a very, very forward thing for Mrs. Ford to insist that she be part of all of the decision making, she be informed. And she never sought the spotlight. She makes that quite clear. But she said to her husband, you know, Jerry, since I am First Lady, I have this incredible platform from which to speak. And so I will seize it. And I'm going to talk to women about making sure they get their health care, their checkups, their mammograms. So she was remarkable in that way. And she went quite public with it. And the media, thank goodness, picked it up without any reluctance. I always ask, when I'm bringing people through the Ford Museum right across the river here, I always ask when we get to the room that's dedicated to Betty Ford, how many women's lives did she save? It's incalculable, but think about it. She would have saved so many women because of her boldness, her forwardness, doing the right thing. A second reason we celebrate Betty Ford and why we want to be a great platform, and we want to join you in this platform, is that she was, as you know, she had a family intervention. It's another healthcare dimension. And this was after the White House. But you go back to 1964, she was trying to open a window in their home in Alexandria, and she wrenched her back. And of course, the doctors in those days, they did what any doctor did. They prescribed some pills. And then, of course, Mrs. Ford was also expected to go out and be in the party circuit. They were on the A list for a lot of parties. And so she'd go out and she'd have that glass of wine or that cocktail. Well, it was a bad combination. And so for the next 14 years, she had to struggle with addiction. And then came a time in the late 70s after the White House where her doctor and the family got together with her in a room and said, it's time for you to seek help. And she resisted and resisted and resisted. And the doctor, this woman was quite perceptive, quite persistent. And she said, Mrs. Ford, it's time for you to seek help. And finally, Mrs. Ford broke down and she said, I know why we're here today. And I know I need the help. Well, that was one of the first and most famous interventions in U.S. history. And so I always ask, in addition to the question, how many women did she save? How many families did she save by giving families the permission to confront their loved ones in a loving environment with the promise of help? But it was necessary to be firm in that situation. Mrs. Ford is also a rock star to us because she very much became involved politically when she supported the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, this led to all kinds of issues, as you can imagine. It led to issues in the Ford administration because, the Ford administration was a little bit more conservative. And should I hesitate here before I tell the story? I see there's.
No, go ahead.
Oh, okay.
Just doing some tech.
Okay. All right.
Tech problems.
So Mrs. Ford was out there saying, yeah, Equal Rights Amendment. I think it's really important that people, that women get involved politically and in a large movement like this. There was still some reluctance. I mean, even though, the women's movement was already in full swing, but there's still some reluctance to do this. And in fact, in the Republican Party and in the Democratic Party, there's squeamishness about, a first lady, taking on a serious political role like this. So what ends up happening is that President Ford's having a cabinet meeting one day, and some of his advisors come up to him and they say, Mr. President, the First Lady's making it a little bit awkward for us because she's out there on the Equal Rights Amendment, and we got to think about an election. President Ford looked at him and said, well, if you have trouble with her office is right down there. You go tell her. Just one of those great moments in the Ford administration's history. Finally, and this is the more nuanced point, but this is the fourth point that I always make about Mrs. Ford when we get to that room in the museum. They had a tough marriage. He was out sometimes in campaign years, 200 nights. She was at home with 4 kids. That's tough. That's a tough assignment. Sometimes she didn't feel that she got the support she needed to have dad right there. And it wasn't because he was, being, deliberately neglectful. He loved his kids and he loved his wife, but he had this mission, this political mission, and it took him out of the home all the time. But she had an attitude toward their marriage, as did he, that marriage is tough. But every day you get up, every morning you get up, and you say, you know what? We fell down here, there, and elsewhere yesterday. We can do better today. Every morning, in a good marriage, a couple get up and they say, we can do better this morning. And when you combine that, her commitment to that marriage, but you also combine it with the fact that they were so different, personality-wise, and in their politics, they were, they kind of varied. They diverged. She was more liberal, and I think sort of expressed the compassionate side of the Republican Party and the side that more Democrats were comfortable with. He was a stodgy fiscal conservative, who really kind of said, well, because I'm a fiscal conservative, I'm probably a cultural conservative and a social conservative because you're not spending money on new programs. Although I would argue that he actually did have some very interesting liberal instincts as well. It's not that simple. But my point is this: they were in a polarity in that marriage. She liberal, he conservative. And every morning they got up and said, we're going to make this work better. And that's a metaphor for the American people. The American people are kind of in a family, whether we like it or not. We don't choose our family, but here we are. And I think just like the Fords, we need to get up every morning and say, we can do better. We are better than what we've been. So that's really, really important. So that's the background with Mrs. Ford's importance and what we like to say at the Ford Foundation. I know Brooke says something similar at the Ford Museum and Library. So then you fast forward from 1974 to 1984 and what happened. This is not the room where it happened. This is not the hotel where it happened. All of the action actually took place on the stage of the Ford Presidential Museum Auditorium, a wonderful space. You had 3 first ladies invited, but only 2 could be there. So you had, Myra and I were just talking about this. I mean, so you had Rosalind Carter and Mrs. Ford. Mrs. Reagan was the sitting first lady. She was not present at it, but there were a lot of wonderful people that I've had the privilege throughout my career of meeting. People like Liz Carpenter, who was just one of the most colorful, interesting people. Lady Bird Johnson's communication director, spokesperson, all kinds. Liz was just unique, and she was as funny as all get out. And since I'm a fellow Texan, I got her sense of humor. She was very, very funny. But I want to read to you something that Mrs. Ford wrote in anticipation of the conference in 1984, because those of you who were here will have so much more to say about it than I possibly can. But I think this sets the stage beautifully. Mrs. Ford writes, "I want this conference to be a substantive and serious inquiry into the evolving role of the First Lady, her public duties, her special interests, and the joys and tensions of an extraordinary responsibility that diminishes but never ends." Never ends. So I think with Mrs. Ford's words, I will end, and I'm honored to introduce Dr. Myra Gutin, who is going to be our next speaker, and she is a professor emerita at Rice University, and she is one of the founders of FLAIR. And is there anything else I should? But your remarkable career, textbook, and everything else. Anything else that? Okay. Well, very good. I could go on and on. Thanks so much. So glad to be here.
Yeah, Myra, you have to move over there.
So apparently the tech.
Would it be easier for me just to pull this down?
It won't go far enough.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, we're gonna have to like kind of use the chairs.
Highway.
Tiffany, do you need to do something first?
Is it working again?
Yes,
Apparently
it
it was Nancy's in.
Oh, wonderful. Sorry about that.
Okay.
I could get you up and back.
Friends, before I begin, I do have some comments that I've written, and I did that because I wanted to get this right. But beyond that, I just wanted to share a quick story about Mrs. Ford and me. I interviewed her in 1979, and we were talking. This was the interview was in Vail, Colorado. We were talking, and we were talking about ERA. And Mrs. Ford said to me, she felt that Rosalind Carter, who was the incumbent first lady at that point, was simply not doing enough. And I was taping the interview, and I said, "Mrs. Ford, would you like me to switch off the tape recorder?" And she said to me, "Oh no, I'd say it to her face." That was Betty Ford. Yeah. So I am Myra Gutin. I am the immediate past president of FLAIR, and on behalf of our president, Nancy Keegan-Smith, our officers and board, it is a great joy to welcome you to this pre-conference with Central States. For a few minutes, I'd like to take you back to April of 1984. I sat across the way at the Ford Museum as Mrs. Ford convened the first ever First Ladies Conference, titled, as Gleaves told you, Modern First Ladies, Private Lives and Public Duties. The conference was organized to afford scholars, historians, and media, and the American public the chance to focus on First Ladies in a forum that had never been available to us before. At the opening session that day, we listened to a keynote address from Dr. Lewis L. Gould, chairman of the Department of History of the University of Texas at Austin, and the person who we credit with being the person who set up the field of First Lady studies. He told us that morning, I'm going to quote here, "We have downgraded a group of women who have fulfilled a unique responsibility. History and circumstances make it necessary to evaluate the First Lady as helpmates, appendages, surrogates, and partners of the president. but these categories should not be barriers to seeing these wives for what they were and are, autonomous human beings with as much claim to the attention of the students of our history as their masculine counterparts. The conference and Dr. Gould's comments have special resonance for me. I had completed my PhD in communication in 1983 at the University of Michigan. My dissertation was titled The President's Partner, the First Lady in the 20th Century. And that dissertation looked at the communication styles and rhetorical stances of 11 First Ladies, from Florence Harding up through the incumbent First Lady at that point, who was Nancy Reagan. After the session ended, I summoned up my courage and I introduced myself to Dr. Gould, and I told him about my dissertation. He gave me his card and he said, "We should be in touch, write to me." I did write to him, and he became my mentor for the most productive portion of my career and helped to mold my research agenda and thoughts and feelings about American First Ladies. That day then, April 18th, remains emblazoned in my mind, because to me, it was both a rallying cry and an invitation to unlimited possibilities. For the field of First Lady studies, it was a watershed moment. Mrs. Ford, Mrs. Carter, Mrs. Johnson, and Eleanor Roosevelt Seagraves were slated to attend and take part in the conference, along with some of their children and a number of former media and staff people. Unfortunately, Mrs. Johnson took ill and she wasn't able to attend, but her daughters, Linda Johnson Robb and Lucy Johnson Turpin, were in attendance, as was Susan Ford Vance. Liz Carpenter, who Gleaves referred to, who had served as both staff director and press secretary to Lady Bird Johnson, was with us, as was Mary Finch Hoyt, who served as East Wing coordinator and press secretary to Rosalynn Carter, and Diane Sawyer, CBS News correspondent. All of them shared their thoughts in various sessions. Some of the sessions were the First Lady in Leadership, the First Lady in the Media, Family Life in the White House, an Inside View, and the First Family and Social Issues, an Inside View. Discussion planning notes for the session on the First Family and Social Issues, which included Mrs. Carter, Susan Ford Vance, and the Johnson daughters, sisters, raised the questions of are presidential wives like wives at all? Have there been times when family members have had mutual interests and joined forces to strengthen a leadership position or role on social issues? So there were a number of topics that were discussed that day. I don't want to give you the sense that it was all seriousness. There were definitely lighthearted moments. Lucy Johnson Turpin, this was one of my favorites, talked about dinners in the Johnson homes. And she said, in our family, we discussed public affairs and politics every night. But if you lost your breath, you lost your place. Which, knowing a little bit about the Johnsons, you can certainly understand. Eleanor Roosevelt Seagraves, who was one of Eleanor Roosevelt's grandchildren and had lived for a short time at the White House, told the story about her being here in Grand Rapids for the conference, and her hotel phone had rung, and a woman asked her if her grandmother had taken a certain type of pills for rheumatism. So Seagraves concluded, if you've had a connection to the White House, you can never get away from it. In concluding the luncheon session, Mrs. Ford told the conference that she was optimistic about the future. Today, we have started a new, and I hope a continuing project. We have set out to look at what the role of the First Lady has been and what direction that role will take in the future. We've made a good start, but it's just the first brush. I hope our 2 days together will focus future attention on what just might be one of the most demanding jobs in the federal government, excepting perhaps the job of the First Lady's husband. While we are the first organized gathering, we are definitely we are not the first to express opinions about the First Lady. Mrs. Ford went on to share some comments made by previous First Ladies about their times and experiences in the White House. She concluded her remarks by telling the audience, "I'll leave you with one thought and its source." The very First Lady, Martha Washington, said, "As I cannot do as I like, I am obstinate and stay home a lot." We all realized the role of First Lady has changed quite a bit since then. Whether it was her idea or not, and we still are not sure who suggested the conference, Mrs. Ford's enthusiastic support for the conference is significant, as it speaks to her understanding of the importance of the role of the First Lady of the United States. At the time of the conference, there were only a handful of books and scholarly articles on the topic. Since the conference, I'm very happy to say interest has burgeoned. As you will hear this morning, scores of books, doctoral dissertations, articles, conferences, and television programs have illuminated our understanding of the presidential spouse. Courses are taught about First Ladies at many colleges and universities. The National First Ladies Library was founded in 1996, and the First Ladies National Historic Site was founded in 2000. And I'm especially proud of the fact that FLAIR, the First Ladies Association for Research and Education, was founded officially in 2021. None of this progress, in my view, could have ever been achieved without that initial action by Betty Ford. For me personally, I went on to have a career as First Lady historian and scholar that I could have never foreseen. It's been an invigorating, challenging, wonderful journey, and I owe much to Betty Ford and the First Ladies Conference of 1984. There is still a great deal of work to be done, and I hope that you will join us as our efforts continue. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Myra. We're going to take just a brief break to get the panel up here, and so I'm going to stop the stream. And those of you who are watching us live, there'll be a break while we get the second stream going. So if you lose us, don't worry about it. That's intentional, and we'll be right back. Bye. Okay, Brooke and Katie, if you want to come on up here.